to the channel. I'm your host, Prickly Hedgehog. This is the DCS SITREP, and if you haven't subscribed already, well, please do so that you don't miss out on news and information about DCS World. Let's dip into last week's newsletter from Eagle Dynamics, which of course was accompanied by a pretty large patch, and for a select few of us who are, I guess, influencers, we got access to the F-15E by Razbam. This is obviously an early build, but it's looking pretty good, and I'm going to give you some of my impressions of that aircraft towards the end of the video. But let's start with looking at the newsletter from last week. It centered mostly on changes to the Apache, and you would have seen a couple of videos from WAGS recently centered on the laser spot tracking system and also the new radar guided missiles. These are the AGM-114L radar-guided Hellfire missiles, which allow the aircraft basically to fire and forget, increasing the helicopter's lethality and also potential survivability in hostile situations. I'm going to add a couple of links below so that you can check those videos out. Wags can obviously explain those a lot better than I have, simply because he's got, a lot more time with the aircraft, and I haven't really been flying the Apache of late to have tested those. The other area that they did focus on was a couple of minor changes to the VHF AM radio, which is now restricted to the bands of 108 to 115.975 megahertz range, and the missile constraints box and rocket steering cursor are now displayed when safe. George AI now uses weapons correctly, and there's no backscatter message when there are no missiles. One of the big changes that many of you will be excited about is the flight model handling, and the Eagle Dynamics team tell us that the range of roll and pitch control has been increased, yet at the same time the stability of the helicopter has been increased in all flight modes, including helicopter controllability at low speed maneuvering, increased helicopter roll stability at sub-maximal speeds, and also improved behavior in transitional modes, so roll in, out, and pitch in and out. The trim position of the helicopter and its controls in hover and level flight modes has therefore slightly changed. They've also done some changes to the control augmentation stability system, which has been tuned for modified flight dynamics model, and altitude channel damping and auto shutdown behavior has been remodeled to react at a specific limit parameters of the engine and vertical speeds. So hopefully this will clean up some of the fuss that has been generated with the way in which the helicopter behaved. And in fairness, I haven't flown it enough to have noticed major problems, certainly without a real-world reference point for how the helicopter behaves in game. What do I know? But there were quite a few people out there that were doing things that earned the ire actually of Casmo. A lot of the behavior that people were complaining about, Casmo's kind of indicated, well, it's the way you're flying the helicopter. And he said it was actually very difficult to recreate some of the issues that people were having in the game based on the way he flew the helicopter. I mean, he's much more of an expert at it than most of us. So yeah, without sort of a real world reference point, it's very difficult to know exactly what is wrong and how it should fly unless you've got some experience in these aircraft. It's very difficult to recreate these kinds of flight models in a video game, essentially. Though Eagle Dynamics, to be fair, does a great job of that. The general handling is pretty good. Of course, there's a major component that's missing, and that is the seat of the pants feel in terms of the physics of acceleration, G effects, so on and so forth, that you just can't recreate. A lot of that has to be done visually, which we'll come to in just a sec, and or sort of audibly, where you're getting sounds that indicate that there's a problem. And other games do this as well. And I've mentioned this before, doing iRacing, when you knew a wheel was breaking loose, there'd be the sound of traction loss, visual shuddering, those kinds of things fool the eye into believing that you are starting to get a feel for what's going wrong with the car. And of course, an aircraft is a lot more sophisticated than that. So it's a very, very challenging job to recreate a true feel when you don't have feel, if you like, from the seat of your pants, that sensation of motion, which can be mimicked with some of the systems that we have today, but they're not accessible to most of us. So Casmo, is an interesting reference point, again, when it comes to these kinds of things, because most of the problem he indicated was caused by user error. Nonetheless, the team at Eagle Dynamics have taken on board some of this, it seems, and have tweaked some of that. So again, I haven't had the opportunity to test that out. Let me know if you have and if you prefer it. There were a range of other changes here too, which I won't go through to. Some of them more aesthetic, and others of them just general bugs that you would expect in a new module of this nature. Now, I mentioned that whole visual physics thing before. In addition to a large number of other changes, the other big hitter in the game, Hebrew Simulations from one of our third-party developers, did some very interesting changes to the F-14. This included the ground handling and suspension overhaul, which they're calling Phase 1 here. So they have improved the general suspension, they've improved taxi behavior and ground roll characteristics, and they've improved ground handling sounds. There's more ground handling improvement to come, they say. They've also added, as a part of that feel that we're talking about here, a pedal shaker sound. And this is above 21 units AOA, which I haven't tested yet. And they've also added wing turbulence and wind sounds for additional feedback cueing at high G or pitch rates. Now, I don't know if this is in response to a video maybe about a month ago in which Ward Carroll and retired Admiral Nasty Manaza were demonstrating some of the handling characteristics in terms of BFM in game, and Nasty was describing having trouble getting his cues sorted out just visually in the game. Partly that was probably, being out of the jet for a long period of time, and also re-immersing himself in a simulation such as DCS. But it was an interesting one to look at because he was talking about the cues that you're looking for. So I'm wondering if Hebrew did pick up on some of that, because it is very, very difficult to measure what's happening with the aircraft where pilots would be in tune with the machine, kind of what we were talking about before. You've got this feel. Again, we don't have that feel when we're sitting in our office chairs or even in our flight seats, whatever you want to call them. We don't have that seat of the pants feel, the shaking, the onset G effects, all of those things are cues which pilots are tuning themselves into for what's happening with the aircraft and how it's behaving and what they are doing with it. And some of those cues are obviously warning signs too, in terms of stall, reduction in speed, so on and so forth. So I think any improvement in visual cues, as I said before, is going to be a big help. Now, I did test out this ground handling suspension system and improved ground handling behavior. There does seem to be less rolling resistance on the ground for the Tomcat. Before, you were sort of rummaging around for, I guess, throttle settings that helped move the aircraft. You tend to power it up and then it would go too fast. You'd drop back the throttles again, the aircraft would slow down almost to a stop, and you'd have to bounce them back up again. Whereas now it's continues to roll with almost no throttle input. So basically, like I said, there's no reduction in rolling resistance. And then you're just using the brakes to bring the aircraft to a halt. It does seem to be a little bit more realistic, if you like, in terms of that roll resistance, and the animations do give you a little bit more feel. There's a little bit more bump and roll, if you like, in the suspension system, which is good. That is a work in progress by the sounds of things, but nonetheless a good one. I really enjoy that because it is kind of annoying trying to move the aircraft around, especially on the deck. Sometimes you'd be sort of over throttling, try to get it to move around on the aircraft carrier. So I haven't tested it on the aircraft carrier yet, so let me know if you've had a shot at that and if it's an improvement. They've also added the DLC deployment sound here, they say, and fixed the damage to the Forrestal from takeoff and landing, and a couple of other things too, including mass for the Phoenix, which will be added to the overall aircraft mass. Even if you don't see that added weight in the game, it's now part of the account of the flight model characteristics. So good stuff there from Heatblur. No word yet, obviously, on the release of the F4 Phantom. For those of you who are chomping at the bit asking, I would imagine they'll be waiting to see how Razbam's F-15E goes, and at some later stage this year I expect we'll get an announcement there, so stay tuned. Another aircraft that got some huge love was the F1 by Argus. This is a lovely little plane too, and it's really coming along nicely. I'd love to spend more time flying this, but time just doesn't allow me to do that. They went through fixes, things to the radios, optical sight fixes, general missile logic, such as wingtip missiles can only be fired with a lock now. They've done more work on the flight control system and autopilot fixes, which is good, and they've done more work on the 3D model textures, and various other fixes and improvements. I'll refer you back to the changelog. My favorite helicopter right now, the Black Shark, has had its APU and engine sounds updated yet again. And as I said before, if I didn't mention, because of multi-threading and all the rest of it that's going on right now, a large number of campaigns needed fixes. So huge number of updates there for campaigns, from the Inherent Resolve campaign by Looking Glass through to the A10C changes that now reflect the proper aircraft too. So quite a lot of stuff going on there. And ED also said we now have a new campaign for the F-18C. This is the Flaming Sunrise campaign. Features the supercarrier. It's a story-driven, semi-dynamic, single-player campaign setting the player in a place of the Squadron XO. You'll plan and lead some combat sorties of your squadron, giving your best to create circumstances for coalition forces to win the war. So it's now out on Steam here. The campaign combines the following modules: the Hornet, the Supercarrier, and the Persian Gulf map, and delivers over 100 pages of tutorials, detailed mission briefings, charts, and kneeboards. So check that out for those Steam players here.
We're in the pipe, 5 by 5.
Alright, well lastly here, let's talk about the elephant in the room, and that was the release to a select few, such as myself, of the F-15E, which garnered plenty of interest from the community and quite a few frustrating comments about, well, if you're releasing it to those guys, why can't I have access to? Well, I understand that. This is just a way of developers generating interest and getting some early feedback from fresh sets of eyes. So be patient, stick around. You'll get your hands on this soon enough. And for those of you wondering when that's going to happen, we still don't have a specific date yet, unfortunately. Nonetheless, I think the fact that it has been put into the hands of, a wider variety of people in the influencer status for DCS world, that can only be a good sign. Now, I'm not going to go through and give you a comprehensive overview just yet. I simply haven't had the time, and I think more importantly, and I think this is the caveat here, that there's something of a review of this or an assessment of this aircraft, and that is, it is extremely complicated. It is definitely a study level sim, and the focus that the team has taken definitely represents a little bit more perhaps than what we've had in the past. Certainly the F-18, the F-16 study sim aircraft. I think more as a comparison, or a better comparison, is probably the A10C2 with a backseat as well. So sort of doubling your degree of complexity. That's the kind of aircraft that this is. So broadly speaking, as an overall or an overarching experience, it's complicated. I think that's the first thing we should say. Secondly, aesthetically, looks amazing. I think this aircraft is absolutely stunning. It's got that visceral kind of feel that older aircraft have. We've kind of moved away more into, you know, the stealth aircraft. Although I think the Raptor looks amazing, but the F-35 is not the most attractive looking aircraft. It's sort of a flying potato, really. But what it does, that's really where it shines. Whereas the F-15, the F-14, the F-16, those are all cool looking aircraft. They bring a certain menace, if you like, in the way that they present themselves, which I enjoy. You know, still the designers of those aircraft had the look in mind, whereas today we have more of a function over aesthetics, if you like. And that's just the nature of aircraft development. So aesthetically, like I said, it's amazing looking, and I think the team have done a great job. Metal to Mesh in particular, with the renderings, the liveries, all the rest of it. It looks really, really cool. I love when it has a lot of ordnance on it, and the big fuel tanks. You've got the CFTs, you've got the underwing, if you like, fuel tanks as well. And I think that's what sort of blew me away, is just how much fuel that this thing can carry. I mean, you've got 30,000 pounds of fuel, around a top weight of around about 83,000 pounds. Whether you could launch from the ground with that, depending on the temperature and stuff like that, and the length of the runway, is another matter. But nonetheless, it is absolutely amazing how much ordnance this can carry. It is a big F-off plane, and that is well more than most of the other aircraft that we have in the game currently can carry. Certainly more than the F-16, certainly more than the F-18. And while you can carry quite a lot of ordnance on the F-18, it suffers from, you know, slowdown. It suffers from the drag. And that was always a thing in the real world between the F-14 and the F-18. The F-14, with the more powerful engines and things like that, could carry quite a lot of ordnance and outdrag the F-18. What you get with the F-15 is these amazing looking asymmetric loadouts and just this phenomenal amount of firepower. So that brings in, you know, some new dynamic to the game and some new playability that players may not have had in the past, some new considerations. Higher loiter times with all the fuel, and longer transit times potentially. It does still, I'm still practicing aerial refueling, so those will still be a feature of the game. Less so if you want to avoid those, of course, with the amount of fuel you can take, depending on the map size, etc., and the mission parameters. But yeah, it's going to bring out some very, very interesting campaigns and missions, I think, from creative people. I'm not really an expert in that area. I'm still trying to figure out how to get a tanker to track properly in the game, so my skills in that area are pretty minimal. But nonetheless, it's exciting to look at, and I think that's a really cool thing. It has to be good looking, otherwise there's no point in buying it, right? There's no point in flying an ugly aircraft. We all love aircraft that look cool. And like I said, the F-16 and the F-14 and now the F-15E look absolutely spectacular. The other big caveat here, which I think is important to note, is the degree of study sim that this is. This is not a jump in the cockpit and fart around and away you go to get the best out of this. It's more complex, I think, than the F-18. It's more complex than the F-16 in many respects, and both of those have a degree of, you know, steep learning, like all simulators of this nature. They are study sims at the end of the day. I think a better comparison is probably more the A10C2 with a backseat as well, to add the extra level of complexity. It has very, very potent sensors on board, starting with the big radar. Remember, in real life, pilots talked about the fact that if it had metal on it, basically that radar can find you. depending on the skill of the operator. And other parameters, obviously weather and things like that, terrain, and so on and so forth. But you understand what I'm saying. It's a very, very potent radar. And if it is in any way, shape, or form recreated accurately in the game, and there are limitations to how much can be recreated accurately, it's going to be a new level of data acquisition, if you like, than perhaps some of the other aircraft that we have right now. I certainly think that's true. And then, of course, we've got the targeting pod, we've got the FLIR systems, or the flare systems, and the navigation pod as well. So all of these things are contributing to a massive amount of SA that other aircraft may not have. The A-10 doesn't even have a radar, for that matter. So the sensor suite is pretty phenomenal, and the interaction with those systems is a little bit different than some of the other aircraft. You'll hear these phrases of taking control, and there is a little bit more management of those systems than we currently seem to have in the game. And that doesn't even include, as I said before, the backseat situation and crew synchronization. So there's a world of really interesting things here. I haven't delved into any of the AI stuff yet, so these are raw impressions that I'm having with the aircraft. So to summarize, I think attractive, 100%. Looks great. I love the bridging between the older and the newer generation of aircraft here, because we still have those fuses and switches, if you like, in the game, similar to the F-14. None of those are actually active, but you know, they're represented visually. And then we have the more modern era of the sensor suites, the multifunction displays, and the data that's available in those to us, and the interaction with the onboard computers and things, and the data acquisition systems that are in the aircraft that require a little bit more management, study, and learning. And that's going to keep you busy. Red Kite produced a video recently kind of hamming that up a little bit and joking. Yeah, it's a 500-plus page manual. 528 pages or whatever it is, 523, I forget. And I haven't gone through all of it yet. So it's going to take some time. And so that's going to, you know, could be potentially off-putting for some players. Metal to Mesh advised me on Twitter, reached out and said that, hey, you're going to need your HOTA set up to do all the switchology properly. So if you're a new player to the game looking to get into this, or you're just starting out, and one of the reasons to get into DCS is because of the F-15E, you're going to need some peripherals. And that might be off-putting for some people. If you don't own peripherals right now, and you're hoping to kind of keyboard all of this stuff, I think that's going to be frustrating in terms of fluidity. Generally speaking, even with the F-18, F-16, having your switchology set up is really, really important. And I've been going through that with one of the guys from the Air Warfare group recently. We've been trying to get back into the F-16 between gigs. And switchology was a huge thing, just to get making sure all my switches were up. Same thing as it was with the A10C2. And it takes a while to learn those things. You know, sometimes they're modeled in the game and you just don't have it set up right, or you're not comfortable using it. So that's going to be a whole level of interaction on its own right. So aesthetically, like I said, great. Study-wise, it's going to be challenging, and that might be off-putting. It's going to need some peripherals. And generally, flying around the flight model on the ground, great. Taxiing, all the rest of it, it's really fun to fly. I've enjoyed that aspect of it. And of course, it flies really well even with the asymmetric loads and carrying a large amount of fuel. It's a beast. It's an absolute beast, and I can see why I have heard real pilots talk about this aircraft still being one of the most capable aircraft in the Air Force's arsenal. Certainly for air-to-ground work, right? Because of the amount of ordnance it can carry compared to other aircraft. So in the air-to-air role, it still has plenty of potency as well because of that big radar, like I said, its ability to reach out and multitask. You know, it's capable basically of detecting ground and air threats at the same time, and you can work up solutions to eliminate those threats at the same time as well. depending on crew coordination. I'm not sure how easy that would be to do as a solo player. I'm sure there'll be people out there testing that in the weeks to come. So the big question, finally, when is it going to get released? Well, we've had no word from Eagle Dynamics, and the email from Wags, he did not tell us when the aircraft is going to come out. Razbam hasn't made any public announcement just yet. So I don't have an answer for you on that, unfortunately. All I can say is, based on what I'm seeing, based on what other people are observing in that niche group of influencers who have had the aircraft, I think it's a positive step in terms of an announcement being made. I think we're very, very close. I hate to be cliche, and I hate to be drumming the same beat as Razbam has said, ED has said soon, 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 and a lot of people are getting pissed off with that. And I want to answer one other question too that people have brought up, like, well, you know, and quite kind of bashing comments. I understand the frustration in terms of the delay between the end of last year and now. I think that's a reasonable thing to be complaining about. What I don't think is reasonable is the vitriolic attacks on the developers in general. A lot of people seem to be under the impression that these things don't take very long. You know, that once a module is kind of announced, then it's ready to go kind of thing. That all the hard work is done. That's not necessarily the case. A lot of these aircraft are actually secretly in development for a couple of years before they have actually been announced. A good one for Eagle Dynamics was the Apache last year, right? It was announced in December of 2021, and it was going to be released. That was the release date, and then we morphed into 2022, and I think it was around March or April, I think, when it was finally released. There was a slight delay there. That aircraft had been in development for 2 years before Eagle Dynamics even announced it. So there's a long developmental process, and there are complex, I think, fluid reasons why these things happen. When you think about every 2 years, computers alone being updated, we've gone from 3000 series graphics cards from NVIDIA to 4000 series graphics cards, and already we're seeing major developments in that area, CPUs. Plus the core engine of the game has changed with multi-threading. Now we can do this. All of these things kind of have collided at the same time. So I think that has been a little bit of an influence in perhaps some of the delays here. So in other words, the developer doesn't have necessarily control over what Eagle Dynamics' timeline is with regards to the core engine and how my module is going to slot in there. Plus, third-party developers are very much under the gun in terms of keeping the product relevant and updated with the core updates. And we've seen that from campaign developers like Baltic Dragon and Reflected, who have talked about how difficult it is to update things and keep things up and running when Eagle Dynamics does updates. So if you're in a developmental process, that could also cause some delays, etc., etc. Those are some guesses. Those are very broad, parameters with which we're discussing. But I think we need to be realistic about why sometimes delays occur. And we've said this in the past, it's a catch-22. Release something too early full of bugs, the public's going to kill you. Kind of drag them on like we've had here. It's delay, 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 soon, 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 and the public's ready to kill you. What do you do? How long do you delay it? Well, that's a question for Razbam and Eagle Dynamics, and all I can say is, overall, this is a very, very exciting aircraft. It's going to be challenging, I think, and it's going to bring some interesting flying experiences for people that are interested in learning how to get to grips with it. It's definitely going to be a study sim. I love it. I think it's cool. And I will bring you more information on the aircraft as I can. It's too early for me to be critical of it because I haven't had enough time to get to grips with it. And I think it would be insincere to talk too much more about it in that shape and too much more about it in terms of what it can do, because I haven't spent enough time with it. I'm still very much learning, and we'll leave it at that. So Thank you for tuning in today. I know this has been a long one. I really appreciate all the feedback. Let me know what you think of any of the topics today, and throw in a guess. Let's see if you're right. When will this be released? I'm predicting, I've heard August. I'm thinking it might be June. We'll see. We're not far away from June right now. We're a week away. I think we might be in for a mid-year release. No word yet on the heat blur, of course, and the F4. Stay tuned for that as well. We've got an exciting year, I think. That'll do for this week. Thanks for tuning in again. This is Prickly Hedgehog out. See ya!